A few semesters ago, I was TAing a class that ended around 10 p.m. After that, I spent about 30 minutes cleaning up the lab and then had a 30-minute drive. So I was usually home around 11 or shortly thereafter. One evening, as I pulled into my neighborhood, I noticed a large pickup truck with a trailer sitting at the stop sign on the street perpendicular to mine. There was a woman standing outside of the car talking to someone, maybe the driver or maybe a neighbor. This immediately struck me as odd because my neighborhood is in a tiny town of only a few hundred people, most of whom have young kids. This means that nobody is out of the house after maybe 9 p.m. and certainly not walking around talking. I drove past. The woman walked to the other side of the truck and got in. As I pulled up to the curb in front of my house, I noticed the truck had followed me. They pulled partly into the driveway of my next door neighbor. That neighbor doesn't have a truck and isn't usually up that late because of the kids. But I wasn't too worried yet. They had moved in only a month or so earlier, so I figured that they must be borrowing a truck and trailer from a friend to finish up the move. I walked quickly across my yard and locked the front door behind me, like I always do. It was only a few seconds later when the doorbell rang. Still thinking that my neighbor was the one in the truck, I assumed that he had seen me drop something in the yard and wanted to let me know. Now comes the stupid part. My boyfriend was in the back part of the basement at the time, and the doorbell isn't audible down there. To get to the basement, I had to walk right past the front door, which has a pane of glass in it. I would be visible to whoever was outside, so instead of letting him know that someone was at the door, I just answered it. It wasn't my neighbor. There was a woman in her 30s standing on my front step. The truck had backed out of my neighbor's driveway and was now parked in the middle of the street, running but with its lights off. Standing around the truck and in my yard were 4 or 5 big burly men, slowly walking towards me. Red flags went off instantly. "Hi," said the woman. "We're here to see those couches from Craigslist. Can we come in?" She took a step towards me, but by then I knew something was up. "You've got the wrong house," I said. I slammed the door as hard as I could and locked it. At this point, my boyfriend had heard me talking to someone and flipped on the basement light that was visible from the front yard. Up till then, the house had looked dark and empty from the street. I ran downstairs, told him the short version, and we each grabbed a weapon. When it was clear the people weren't coming back, I called the sheriff, and they took a full report and drove around the small town to see if the truck was still around. I really hoped they would see these folks at another house nearby loading couches, because that would mean it was an honest mistake. Just to be sure, I checked Craigslist myself, as I had feared there were no couches or anything else for sale within 20 miles of me. I later learned that this was a common MO for criminals. Stake out a quiet neighborhood and wait until a single woman comes home alone. Have a female accomplice make up an excuse to get her to open the door, and bam. I don't know if they just wanted to rob the house or worse, but I'm very glad I wasn't home alone, and to this day I don't answer the door unless I'm armed. So crazy Craigslist people, let's not meet again. A few weeks ago, I had to fly out to a small town I'd never been to in order to look for a place to live. I'm moving there in the fall to start grad school. My boyfriend flew with me, and before the trip, I researched all sorts of apartments on Craigslist and set up a bunch of appointments. Our first appointment was in the afternoon in this sort of remote residential area. The landlord sounded fine over email and asked me to call him an hour before the appointment to confirm that I was coming. I called. He didn't answer. So my boyfriend and I started walking to the house and just hoped that he would show up. Maybe 10 minutes before the appointment, he called me. "Are you coming?" he asked. He sounded like an older man and had this very strange, slow way of talking, but I just thought he was older. "Yes, we're in front of the house now." He got extremely upset. "We?" "Oh yes, my boyfriend's with me." "You never told me you had a boyfriend. You never said that." It had never crossed my mind to have to tell him this information, since my boyfriend would not be coming to live with me. He was just helping me look for apartments on the trip. I told the man so, and after a very long pause, he said, "I'm sorry. It's just, sometimes people don't tell me when they're married, and it surprises me. I'll see you soon." Then he hung up. I told my boyfriend about what the man had said, and he was immediately weirded out. He wanted to leave, but there were slim pickings in terms of real estate at this point. So I stupidly said we had to stay, in case this place was the place. As we're discussing it, we see a man leave the house we're going to view. This man was young and extremely sketchy looking. Greasy hair, furtive eyes. He took one look at us and ran out of the house to his car and pulled away from the curb with a screech. Okay. So now we're really weirded out. But this isn't enough for us to bail just yet. And as we look at each other wondering what to do, the landlord arrives. He's in his 50s, very tall and very strong looking. His eyes are completely blank and empty of warmth or emotion. He slowly walks up to us and says, "I'd shake your hands, but mine are dirty." "What from?" my boyfriend asks. "Work," is the flat reply. He asks us a lot of questions about me, completely ignoring my boyfriend. The entire time he stares into my eyes without blinking. What am I going to school for? What other places am I considering for living? Is my boyfriend moving to this town too? I try to give answers that are as vague as possible. Meanwhile, my boyfriend asks the landlord questions of the same kind, which he refuses to answer. Then he says, apropos of nothing, "Let me show you the basement." At this point, I should have noped out of there, but I didn't. I kept thinking this was an eccentric old man from a small town, we're city folk, and that we were just feeling paranoid. My boyfriend, on the other hand, wanted out of there, but he followed us as the man led us to the back of the house, away from the street, to this sort of detached shed. He opened the door and we saw that there were stairs leading down into utter darkness. He flipped the switch at the top of the stairs and the light didn't come on. Normally the response for this is, "Oh shit, the light's out," or something like that. But he just said, and slowly walked down into the darkness. He stood there without moving in the dark and said, "Aren't you coming down?" "There's nothing to see if the light's out," says my boyfriend. The landlord just stands there for a long time, then slowly walks up the stairs and closes the basement door without saying anything. He took us into the house. Weird and increasingly creepy things ensued. The front door, the only exit to the house, locked automatically, and when my boyfriend tried to fiddle with it, the man got really upset and told him to leave it alone. He managed to get it open secretly, though. The man kept trying to box us into small rooms and, according to my boyfriend, kept reaching his hands into his pockets, only to take them away when he caught us looking. On Craigslist and in person, the man claimed that there was a grad student already living in the house, but the evidence of that seemed arranged. There were neat piles of generic textbooks on the table, but not other things a 20-something might read. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, but no other food in the fridge or pantry, or utensils. There were maybe 3 shirts in the closet. This supposed grad student wasn't out of town, but the landlord couldn't say what school he went to or how long he'd been renting the house. Finally, the man had showed us every single room in the house, but one. This one he refused to open, claiming it was just the attic, and we didn't need to see anything up there. He gave us several reasons when we inquired. It was unfinished. There was furniture up there. It would smell bad. This last one I believed, because standing near the door, it smelled terrible. Finally, we made our excuses and bolted out of there. The man walked us out, pretended to go to his car to leave, and when he thought we had turned the corner, slowly sauntered back into the house. My boyfriend, fixated on the idea that there was something wrong with this guy, Googled the man that night. We found out 3 things. That he was a pillar of the community, known by a lot of townspeople. That there was no evidence of him owning or managing a real estate company, as he claimed on Craigslist. And that he had listed his home address as the very house we had been touring. The house where the grad student lived. So that was the creepiest thing that had ever happened to me. A couple of years ago, after my ex left, my daughter and I were looking for a place to rent. Our house was too big and I couldn't afford it on my own. Plus, it was filled with far too many raw, painful memories of the family we'd only recently ceased to have. I was checking ads on Craigslist and found one that sounded perfect. Excited, I didn't really think about bringing someone with me. I wanted to get to it before someone else snatched it up. I called and agreed to meet the owner in 30 minutes at the place. I was thrilled. It was a small cottage, perfect for the 2 of us with a porch and small yard. And it came with a gas range, which I always prefer. I got there a few minutes early because I absolutely loathe being late for anything. and waited in my car until the appointed time, just in case he was not already in the house. Then I walked up and knocked on the door. He answered surprisingly quickly, leaving me with the impression he'd been watching me walk up through the peephole. No biggie, I thought to myself. Probably wanted to see what sort of person I was. He opened the door wide and invited me in with a toothy grin. He was a little bit older than me and quite tall. I, at 5'4", had to look up to talk to him. I walked past him into the front room of the house, and turned about to ask about the utilities when I saw him flip the lock on the deadbolt. Instantly the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to pound. He began walking toward me, still grinning, and I stuttered on my words. Everything about this suddenly felt so wrong. I walked toward the kitchen as I continued to talk, hoping for a back door. I figured I'd use the excuse of seeing the yard to get out, just as he was about to close the distance between us, not having said a word since inviting me in. My phone rang. I quickly grabbed it from my purse and answered, happy to have someone on the line. It was my friend, whose house my daughter and I were staying at until we found a place. "Hi!" I said, probably much too enthusiastically. I didn't hear a word she was saying, I just kept talking quickly. I'm at address of the house I was in, looking at a place. Want to meet me here since it's right down the block from there? Mind you, she lived a couple miles away, but he didn't know that. As soon as I hung up the phone, he rushed me out the door, hurriedly explaining that he just remembered an important meeting he had to go to. I was so relieved for my friend's fantastic timing, and wasted no time in getting to the door. He unlocked it, looking at me strangely as he did, and stood there as I left, telling me we could reschedule for another time, as if. I am convinced that something very bad would have happened to me had my friend not called when she did. The whole experience gave house hunting a whole new meaning for me, and I didn't go look at a single place alone after that, no matter who it was on the other end doing the renting. At the time, I was a few months into undergrad in Austin, Texas, and had just become comfortable enough with myself to come out of the closet. At the time, there were no dating apps available, so to find dates I used Craigslist. Big mistake. I started chatting with a guy off Craigslist, Craig, and we hit it off and decided to set a time and place for a date to meet in person. His ad said he was 27 and I was 18 at the time. At first, he was very insistent on meeting at his place, which I later found out was just a trailer, and it kind of made me suspicious. But in his pictures, he was very good looking, had a nice smile, etc. So I decided to let it go. Eventually, we agreed to get coffee before going to his place. So the day arrived and I went to get coffee, and I was pretty excited. I had showed my roommate pictures of Craig, and talked about how I was looking forward to meeting him. I showed up at the coffee shop and he was already there. He actually did look like his pictures, so that was a good start. We got coffee and ended up chatting for several hours before he asked whether I wanted to go back to his place. Luckily, my roommate called to check up on me, and it also happened that he was stranded because his car had broken down. So I told Craig that I would take my friend back home before heading over to his place. Well, by the time I picked up my friend, Craig was no longer answering his phone or texts, or anything. When he finally answered, he accused me of making up some excuse so I wouldn't have to go back to his place with him, and basically was very angry and annoyed despite our great conversation earlier. I was a bit bummed out, but basically didn't think of him again until years later when my roommate sent me a link for a news article about Craig. Apparently, he had been running a sex trafficking ring, using underage boys that he would lure through his good looks and promises. I can only imagine what would have happened to me if I had gone back to his trailer with him that day. I know this isn't as creepy as other stories, but it definitely gave me the chills when I read the article. Now, this encounter is probably not as LMN as some of the others, as it doesn't involve a stalker or anything, but it sticks out to me as it was simultaneously the single most uncomfortable moment of my life and the stupidest I've ever been. When I was a freshman in college, 2010, I was 17 years old. I went to school about 6 hours away from where I lived. I had to get home for Thanksgiving, so I talked to some friends about it, and was directed to Craigslist. I know, but back then, and in the area I lived in, believe it or not, Craigslist did not have the huge negative connotations that it does now. The first time I booked a rideshare, I gave my roommate the man's email address and full name. bought a big box cutter to keep in my pocket, and was generally on edge the entire time. Until it turns out he was just a 60-year-old, well-groomed, polite Asian man, with 3 other college kids in his car driving up to see his granddaughters. Now, this encounter, coupled with the fact that all my college friends were telling me good stories about their own ride shares, made me a little bit more comfortable than I should have been. By the time I booked my rideshare for Christmas break, I was almost entirely relaxed about the entire situation. I was unarmed at the very least. So I got a phone number from a man who was driving back to my area, and he informed me that we would be leaving from my dorm at 2 in the morning. I was ready, packed up, and downstairs. He had not arrived until 5:45, and I, of course, had not yet slept as I was at the door all night waiting for him. It was not until much later, when I was already in the car with this man, that I read some of his texts he had sent me on his way there. They basically said that he had another person offering him $100, more than I was a little down the road, and he implied very heavily that if he were going to pick me up, he needed something extra to convince him. I don't remember the exact wording, but he meant sex. Now remember, he came directly to me to pick me up with no one else in the car, which to me meant that he was bluffing about the other passenger. The man eventually pulls up. He was a mid-20s, decently attractive Mexican guy with a highly decorated black pickup truck. I loaded my stuff into the back seat and tried to get in next to my bag, but he insisted I sit up front next to him. Now at this point, my overprotective dad, who shows up in all my stories, was texting me to see how everything was going. When I told him I was feeling uncomfortable, he immediately demanded I send him pictures of the license plates. I didn't understand at the time, but I got out of the car and did it, explaining, "Oh, my dad said he just wants the license plate number." I truly think that may have deterred this man from doing anything serious. Now at first, I was just a little uncomfortable in the car, until the man exclaimed that he had lost his phone. He went back to where he had parked and looked everywhere for it. I am not sure if he was telling the truth or not, but I do know that this meant he spent the rest of the 6-hour drive borrowing my phone and running the battery all the way down to nothing. After about 30 minutes of silence, the man addressed the text messages he had sent me, apologizing for them and saying that he hadn't meant anything. Not knowing what he meant, I said that he was alright. He asked me if I had a boyfriend. Now at this point, I was checking my phone out of curiosity and beginning to see the gross things he had sent me, so I immediately lied, saying that yes, I did, and that he was also a bodybuilder. That was the wrong thing to say. The conversation immediately turned sexual in nature, and he began asking me how far we had gotten, how many other boyfriends I had in the past, what I let him do to me, if I had ever had sex with my female roommate, etc. I remember feeling panicked and sleepy and not knowing what to do. Now, in addition to all this weird sexual harassment, this man also mentioned that he was driving up from Mexico, where he was in a gang. He pulled out illegal manta ray skin cowboy boots that were apparently the signature of his gang, and he made me feel them. They had skulls on them, and I was just confused and compliant, and I felt the shoes, and I honestly didn't know what was happening. It's still all a blur to me because I was so tired. I do know that he heavily implied that getting the skulls on your boots involved killing someone, and I also know that at one point I closed my eyes for just a moment while he was playing loud Spanish music from the radio, and I woke up to his hand on my leg. I crossed my legs and sat up and spent the rest of the ride looking out the window, ignoring him completely as he tried to engage me in more sexual conversation. With my last bit of battery, I texted my dad and explained to him that I needed him to pick me up as soon as he possibly could. My dad managed to get one of my aunts and my 18-year-old cousin to drive an hour out of their way to come and get me at the bus station. When the man pulled up to the station, he asked if it was my dad or boyfriend who had come to get me. When I told him it was my aunt, he gave me a strange look and started to pull away from the curb. I was more than a little freaked out, so I opened the door, and my cousin, who knew a little of what was going on, spotted me and ran up to the driver's side door. He stared directly into the man's face, thanked him with a smile, and slid the $200 I owed him into the man's hand. He then pulled me out of the car and into his own, where I promptly began shaking. Now, I have thought this over 1,000 times, trying to rationalize things from his point of view. And one explanation I've come up with is that maybe this man was just heading north and hoping for a sexually promiscuous young college girl to take along with him as a perk. Or else maybe he was looking for a naive young college girl to abduct and rape. I am not sure, but if it was the second one, he surely would have gotten what he wanted, had it not been for my dad and my cousin.